time to yield such time as he may consume to my colleague from Western New York, from the Southern Tier, Mr. Reed.
Well, I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I thank the gentleman, Mr. Faso and Mr. Collins, for their leadership on this issue. You know, Mr. Speaker, in my district, the 23rd Congressional District, where we saddle the border of the state of Pennsylvania, when you talk about the tax burden that is placed on my hardworking residents that are struggling, that are trying to pay utility bills, that are trying to pay for food to put on their tables, that are trying to take care of their families and put their kids through school. When you talk about a tax burden that is driven by the Medicaid shift in New York State to the local level, at our county level, a very unique circumstance across the country, to the tune of $145 million a year in each of the counties we represent. That type of burden is not sustainable. And I thank the leadership of Mr. Faso, Mr. Collins, for looking for a solution in the American Health Care Act that will alleviate this, that for once and for all will shift this burden from our hardworking citizens, our hardworking taxpayers in Western New York, back to where it belongs, to our state capital where they have mandated, under the federal Medicaid program, essentially every optional service that is authorized under the program. Where you see numbers in New York State where we spend approximately $4,000 per enrollee versus, take California, another state that has invested tremendously in expanding Medicaid and Medicaid services at $2,500. Where you see reports that in New York State, our average costs are 44% in New York State under Medicaid spending than the national average. And then you look at small things, but that do add up. Taxi services that are reimbursed under Medicaid in New York State at the tune of $2.20 a mile. Every hardworking resident in my district, Mr. Speaker, that is watching tonight knows that if they go to submit a mileage reimbursement to their employer, or they go and try to get reimbursement from their local government that they work at, they're getting 55 cents or maybe 53.5 cents. That money adds up. And you also see a Medicaid program in New York that is ripe with waste, fraud, and abuse. And by putting this $145 million tax burden on our local taxpayers, our counties cannot address that waste, fraud, and abuse. That can only be done in our state capital. So I think it's only right that we put the burden on our state capital, who has the authority, the flexibility, and the ability to address these issues, to have to deal with this burden at the same time they can implement solutions. If our governor so chooses to make this type of waste, fraud, and abuse rampant through Medicaid, that's his choice. But he shouldn't put it on our backs, our local residents' backs, to the tune of $145 million of taxpayer dollars that they have no ability to address at the local level. You know, I also remember vividly a story from one of our first responders, you know, our Olean firefighter, who came in and talked about him being part of a volunteer ambulance service where they would pick up individuals who would call for services and claim to be experiencing a medical emergency, and then as they delivered the patient to the hospital, that same patient would refuse service at the ER so they could go to the mall across the street. A ride in an ambulance that is paid for by our hardworking residents in Western New York. We're generous people. We don't mind helping people out. But when you put a burden like this on our backs and you don't give us the flexibility and ability to address these concerns, that's wrong. And what this amendment does, and I am proud to support it and stand here with my colleagues, is right this wrong once and for all and put the burden where it needs to be, in our state capital. Let our governor own this and hopefully wise up and deal with it at that level and take this burden off our hardworking taxpayers. So thank you, Mr. Faso, Mr. Collins, for this leadership, and we are wholeheartedly behind you. And with that, I yield back to the gentleman from New York.
Well, thank you, Mr. Reed. And I think you raise a very